All right, welcome back to What Are You Watching? It's our once every other week, once a fortnight show. We're Peter Henry, Matt Wiggins. We both work here at DCPC, Davidson College Presbyterian Church. And it's where we talk about what we're watching because it's a pandemic, thus the mask and the distance, and plenty of time to watch just about anything. So this week is actually kind of interesting because we picked two films that are both released in the last year, 2019 and 2020. And they might be a little bit harder to find on a streaming service, but I think they're going to both be worth watching. Well, I don't know. Actually, I haven't seen his movie. He hasn't seen my movie, so we're going to discover some stuff. And that's going to happen all in the next 20 or so minutes. So the bell is about to ring up there on the steeple, and that'll let us know we'll be timing this out really well. And the other thing you need to know is that we're also going to spoil the two movies that we're talking about. So
not spoil them by ruining them, but telling you what happens.
Yeah, and honestly, these are both based on real events, so if you know a little bit of history, you probably know the end of these movies anyway. So this is a great episode that even if you haven't watched them, you can just watch right now. Or you can always hit pause, hit the watch later button, and come back to this episode when you're ready. But to start us off, Peter's going to talk about Harriet.
Sure, and you may have just said it, I apologize. Kind of our general overarching theme for this episode is God is on our side. And Harriet is a movie based on the life of Harriet Tubman. Now, we should all not be surprised that while it retains the truth of Harriet's story, it's also Hollywood's version of her story. So it probably fictionalizes a few kernels of truth. It certainly makes some things particularly large. There's the bell. But it is a phenomenal movie if you've not had a chance to watch it. And it again is about the life of Harriet Tubman and the particular elements of this woman who is a slave who gets to freedom. So she is in Maryland and she runs away from her master's family, ends up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, finds a society that is part of the Underground Railroad that frees slaves. And she goes on to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad despite everybody's insistence that she shouldn't. She's too fresh to the north. She's too raw from the emotions of slavery. She can't even read. She's not very experienced. There's a whole long list of reasons why she's not supposed to go back and get her family and bring them to safety. And yet she does. Over and over, she goes back. She frees slaves. She becomes, she's given the name Moses. And people are out to get her. They think she's a man. They think she's a white abolitionist. They think she's a big black man. There's a long list of things. Bottom line is they don't really know who she is for a long time as she continues to free slave after slave after slave. And it goes from the period before, it begins in like 1850 something, before the actual Runaway Slave Act is passed, up through the enactment of that passage where the freed slaves in the north have to go even further north to escape the possible clutches of slave hunters and the law, who are now after slaves wherever they can find them. No longer does the Mason-Dixon line hold any sort of power to stop people from pursuing slaves. Harriet Tubman, her movie Harriet is fascinating on a couple of points on a religious front. One of which is that at the very beginning, we see a scene that reminds us of the negative role that religion played. So Christianity was a tool of slave masters. Ironically enough, when Christianity came to slaves in the 16th century, down in Savannah, Georgia, where we have what we think is the first evidence of slaves or enslaved people becoming Christians and having their own churches, there was always concern and caution on the part of slave masters. What happens if they take too seriously these stories about Moses? And so slave masters would control what their enslaved people would hear and who was allowed to preach to them. And they were allowed to preach passages like, slaves, be obedient to your masters. They were allowed to hear from Philemon, where Paul sends a slave back to his master. Weren't allowed to hear so much about Moses. And unauthorized preachers had to hold church services at night, back behind the slaves' houses, and under penalty of death should they be caught preaching anything other than the master's line in terms of being obedient to your slave master. So the opening scene of Harriet is a black preacher preaching obedience to the slaves who are gathered at the slave master's house for church that day. Interestingly enough, it's that very minister who later on in the movie, it turns out, helps to get people onto the Underground Railroad and up to the north. because when Minty's father, Harriet, it's her slave name, her father says, go to the minister and ask him to bless your journey. She's like, I'm not going to him. Like, he tells us to be obedient. Her father's like, go to the minister and ask him to bless your journey. And in fact, he tells her how to get north and to be freed. So that's one interesting element of religion in this. The other interesting element is that she has spells. Spells in which she faints, but spells in which she receives visions that she says are from the Lord. And the Lord's showing her what's going to happen before it happens so that she can act on the vision. And certainly any of us who are part of our Judeo-Christian background, we have a long history of visions and signs in the Bible. We don't know what we would make of a modern-day Presbyterian walking into our sanctuary and saying, I have a vision from the Lord, and saying, no, it's a real vision. But nonetheless, biblically and in the movie of Harriet, real actual visions in which she has a sense of what God is going to lead her to do. Consistently, what God leads her to do is to free other slaves at the risk of her own life to be part of this movement of God and the people of God. And of course, there are pivotal moments of confrontation with her master, moments of drama where it looks like the jig is up, a sad scene in which one of her saviors of sorts is killed by a slave catcher. So it's got all the stuff that makes for a good story. And Hollywood does it up well, as if Harriet's story wasn't good enough on its own.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. So I haven't seen it, but I read the Rotten Tomatoes kind of like critics' consensus, and it said something. It kind of gets a little bit formulaic. Like, I was kind of curious what that was.
Yeah, formulaic. I mean, they keep having these teaser moments where she almost gets caught by her former master. Yeah. He almost sees her, and then she escapes, and then, yeah, there's definitely some formula to this.
Right.
But one of the things that stands out about Harriet as well, and appropriate for the summer of 2020, is that similar to Black Panther, I mean, it is a movie in which it is almost entirely a black cast, and the folks who are white are in, I'm not going to call them minor roles, there is a master, but nonetheless, by and large, he's about the only significant white figure in this movie, and it's not Hollywoodish from that standpoint.
And it's directed by a black woman, too.
Correct, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
That's fascinating.
So Harriet, set in the 19th century, involving African Americans with no power empowering themselves, is a little bit different than Matt's movie that he's chosen.
So The Outpost is a very recent movie. In fact, it should have been in theaters this spring, but then COVID happened, and it's gone straight to video on demand. And so The Outpost is based on a true story. Jake Tapper from CNN wrote a book about an action in the, I'm going to probably say it wrong, the Nuristan province of Afghanistan.
Keep talking.
So in the story, is basically an American outpost is set up at the base of a giant valley, and there's this moment where they kind of take you into the center of this camp, and you look around, and it looks like you're in the bottom of a bowl. And I mean, I'm not a military strategist, but that's terrible. Like, right? Obi-Wan said, Anakin, I have the high ground, don't do it. Like, this is not where you want to be, but there's this encampment, they're completely isolated, like it's hard to get helicopters in there, like there's one truck there that they got there and they couldn't get it back out.
Can I interrupt for a moment?
Yeah.
Does it look anything like the image that you're about to advance onto the screen while you're talking
about it?
Yes. Anyway.
I've been really bad about that like this whole time. We're gonna work on it. So anyways, it's this kind of, who was it? Hitchcock, Alfred Hitchcock said that suspense is when you put a bomb at a table and then you have two people come and sit down at that table and they don't know what is there, but the audience does. So this is a moment where it's a different suspense because everybody at this outpost knows what's going to happen and the audience knows what's going to happen. And so in a 2-hour movie, roughly the first half is a setup and the second half is what happens when the Taliban actually attacks. So one of the really amazing things about this movie, and it's in a way it's kind of a parallel to Harriet, is that the men who were there were involved in the making of this movie. As Jake Tapper, interviewed these men, and then in the end credits you see interviews, and actually side by side of the actor who is portraying the real soldier, and they interview the real soldiers. Some of the soldiers actually portrayed themselves in the movie, which I couldn't even imagine. And so this movie is really fascinating, and it's very new. It's very raw. It has a lot of documentaries or a lot of war movies have a very the Hollywood thing. You expect like certain types of characters and all that, but this movie definitely feels feels very real. It feels very documentary-like. And one of the things that I really appreciate is that the soldiers talk like what you expect soldiers to talk like. Just it's very raw dialogue. If you're a person who doesn't like a lot of rough language, this is not the movie for you. I was trying to look up some of the dialogue from the movie in the script, and I was looking for God and Jesus, and those words appear a lot, but very rarely in in kind of a similar way we might say it here in church. And and some of the dialogue is actually like overtly theological. But I don't think that's where the movie's going. But it's one of those places where they're in a place where they know they're in danger, where they know that like thoughts about life and the afterlife are important to them. But that's not where they're dwelling, because there's the mission, there's their lives, there's their buddies, like kind of right there. So
Matt, I want to ask you a question, and this is both an observation and a question. So when I watch movies that have real difficult violent scenes, and I'm not talking about gratuitous violence, but I'm talking about being able to truly get a little more of a visceral sense of what it means for a master to physically punish a slave or to watch a battle. That is really hard for me. That's why I had to really struggle to get through Black Hawk Down and all of that. And what helps you? I mean, I've got a sense of what gets me through those. But I mean, do you is that a struggle for you to watch that kind of realistic, violent action? Is it hard, and what keeps you in not turning away?
I think for me, if you know me, like I don't know, anytime there's a blood donation, what do they call it? Blood drive. At the congregation house, like I can't be near it. I can't, I do not do well with blood or gore or anything like that. And so there's, for me, like, it's a great question, because it's not something I enjoy at all. But I think for this movie specifically, knowing the story and why it's being told, there's a great book that I really like called What It's Like to Go to War by Karl Marlantes.
Is this a book or a podcast?
This is a book.
Okay.
Believe it or not, I read
Matt
books
listens
too.
to lots of podcasts.
And he talks about the fact that he served in Vietnam, and he talks about, like, he's writing it in like the 2000s, and he said, even though right now I am not in combat, I am not sending people to combat, I have a part in the system that has put young men and women in danger. And he said by voting, by putting elected officials in there. So for me, there's almost a responsibility to hear the stories of people who, and the war in Afghanistan, I'm old enough that I've been voting for people who have sent people to Afghanistan and Iraq. So there's a part of me that feels like I have almost a responsibility to kind of part of these stories.
And that's I don't know that I was specifically thinking about that word, but responsibility, obligation. I feel like for a certain amount for certain stories, really, Peter, it's hard to watch that. People live through that or died because of that. Like, surely there's a responsibility to be able to bear witness to what happened to others, bear witness to a society, a world in which at some level I've been a part of it, whether by voting or eventually just receiving. And part of the reason I asked the question is, Matt, too, is that I feel like you had a really particular great find about your movie, about the role of that storytelling.
Yeah.
And that by being willing to listen to the story, that it plays a role for people. So tell folks about your find.
Yeah, so one of the soldiers in the story, his name is Stoney Porter. I think that's right, Stoney Portis. And he actually wrote an article in the New York Times talking about the movie right before it came out. I think it premiered around Independence Day weekend, and said, this isn't just like a war movie, an action movie. This is a story of real people. And they actually screened the movie for that particular unit, and the director was part of that, and he was just kind of terrified, like, what is their reaction going to be? But I'm going to refer to my notes. I do take notes. Portis, he talks about a book called Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming. It's a book by Jonathan Shea. And he says that by sharing their stories, soldiers and other people who have experienced trauma can have a catharsis of sorts through a communalization of grief, in which trauma survivors tell stories and listeners can listen, believe, and remember. And this is when the circle of healing is complete. I thought that was a really powerful thing. I didn't know that until this morning, basically. But it made a difference.
And when I think about, especially these days with these wars that aren't so far in the past, and these wars that now include fewer and fewer of our American citizens, which is a good thing. But if 1% of the American populace have been combat veterans or veterans, let alone combat veterans, as to Matt's point, if we've sent them off to war, what's our responsibility to listen to them? And if watching a movie is part of the way that for some there's a sense of a circle of healing, like we've participated in the damage done to them to some extent. Are we going to sit with participation in the healing? So I appreciate hearing that, particularly from one of the actual survivors, one of the combat veterans, saying it does play a role for us. That was a great point.
Yeah, well, and I think it. And we didn't plan this going in, but I think that's what connects it to Harriet too. I mean, the idea that that story allows us to empathize with somebody. You know, like there's actually research that says like people who read lots of fiction are better at empathizing with people than if you don't read a lot of fiction. And so I think, you know, as we sit here as two white men, you know, being, you know, like going and entering into Harriet Tubman's story, as it's told by people of color and you know, a Black woman director, I think, you know, it feels small, like it feels ineffectual, but I feel like it is a positive step.
Sure. Yeah, you know, and we're taping this in a summer where this conversation about Black lives and the way in which they haven't been honored and they haven't mattered in our society, and the willingness of corporations and churches to say Black lives do matter, and then to talk about practical things like, do we shop at Black-owned businesses? Do we empower Black leaders? And certainly this cast, this director, this story, and participating at some level can be part of our repentance regarding the past, as well as our desire for a better future. And a segue into my scriptural comment would be this. We're recording a day after Davidson College, through its commission, apologized for the role that Davidson College played in perpetuating slavery and perpetuating Jim Crow laws. We'll let you read the entirety of that report on your own. But, you know, the reality is that Southern Presbyterian Christians participated in giving cover for slavery. So I want to highlight one particular piece of scripture in that regard. The letter of Philemon by the Apostle Paul. He's writing to a slave owner named Philemon, Philemon, however you want to pronounce it. His slave Onesimus has run away and come to Paul. And slave owners used to say, hey, look, Paul sends a slave back to his master. See, you know, slaves have to be obedient. And there are one or two pieces of scripture that talk about obedience. I'm not going to deal with all those today. But in the letter, Paul says to Philemon, I'm sending him back to you. I could have told you to set him free. And by the way, did I remind you, Philemon, that you owe me? So I could tell you. And by the way, maybe he came because you couldn't be bothered to come and support me in my time of need, but your slave did. And again, I could tell you to set him free, but that wouldn't be good for you. And he more or less says, you owe me. You need to do this. I'm sending him back so that you get to set him free. But slave masters were never quite able to read between the lines, or chose not to. And yet when you have a careful reading of Philemon, it's really clear the Apostle Paul wants the slave free. And unlike some of the other letters that talk about being obedient to slave masters that aren't necessarily truly Paul's, Philemon is in fact one of the uncontested letters of Paul, in which he clearly is making a statement about slaves and slave masters. So that kind of stands for me in the background as I hear these pieces of the movie that talk about what it means to be obedient and to be free. How about you? Any particular scriptural connection, Matt?
Yeah, so I struggled with this one a little bit, but here's where I'm going to land. I'm going to land on the story of Joshua. So there's this moment where Joshua is leading Israel over across the River Jordan. And then there's kind of this weird moment where like they get across and God tells Joshua to get the 12 leaders together, and each of them grab 12 stones from the middle of the river, and then they're going to pile them up on the bank. And it's like, okay, sure, God. But then God explains that like when the children say, what do these stones mean? I'm going to grab my notes again. What do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the river, when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut up. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. And I love that. And there's another article that helped me kind of contextualize this too. But I did a lot of reading today. But just the idea that story is important to God, that remembering is important to God. And like when we look at Jesus almost always teaches in story. Like the arc of the Old Testament and the New Testament is story. Like story is important. And I think like there can sometimes fiction is escapism, but sometimes fiction is escapism that helps us to see our actual lives in a new way. And I think both of these movies I think are good ways to do that.
Well, Matt, I love that reminder about the story. I mean, the truth of Scripture is not that there's a bunch of doctrine that's been dumped down on us. There are a bunch of stories that have been told from which we pull doctrine. And then, of course, in our modern day and age, often we take our doctrines and we try and tell stories that reinforce them, but they begin as stories.
Yeah.
And the stories are markers in a variety of ways. So I love that, Matt. So how would you rate this movie, Outpost?
Yeah, it's not for everybody. I mean, kind of what you said. And you mentioned Black Hawk Down, and this movie is very similar. Both have Orlando Bloom, actually. Okay. It's really well done. I think it's an important film because of its context, which I've just talked about for a while. So I'd say it's tense. It's an unbelievable story. Story like as a story 8 out of 10.
Okay.
Theological content. It's interesting. There's a couple places where they do have some theological conversations, and I don't think much of what they say is actually in the Bible that they say is in the Bible, but it's there, it's present, and it does. There are some parts that make you think. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10.
Okay, all right. Orlando Bloom, really?
Yeah, he's
in Black Hawk Down.
Yeah.
Okay. Orlando Bloom, who was the hot guy from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
So is Ewan McGregor too.
What? I know.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. That's Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah.
And Jesus, by the way, in a different movie.
That's right.
So when it comes to Harriet, like I would give the movie overall like a 9. I realize it's Hollywood's version of a true story, but I like Hollywood's version of stories. So I'd give it a 9. And then theologically, there's the reminder of the role that theology played negatively. There's the reminder of the way that despite the fact that Christianity was the religion of their oppressors, that the enslaved people would find nonetheless the God who speaks and empowers, frees. There are other little things that maybe we would miss out on, but the role of spirituals as a form of communication to God, to one another. Often when Harriet needs to communicate to slaves in the field, she sings to them, and often is singing them little bits and pieces of spirituals that they would have learned in worship. So, I give it a 9 overall. I'd give it a 9 in terms of theology, too. And I would say that there's nothing in this movie that should scare anybody away in terms of violence. There is some violence. We don't get it up close. It's not quite as personal. It's not like watching The Passion of the Christ with Mel Gibson or something like that.
It's a PG-13, right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And Outpost is on.
Streaming on HBO Max.
It's available for rental on most of the sites. It's not streaming anywhere for free with a subscription yet, but that's going to change. It's still a really good movie.
Thank you for joining us for What Are You Watching? As always, don't forget to like, share, let us know what you're watching. Tell us if there's something you want us to be discussing, because we're not sure what our next episode is, so we'll be more than happy.
Real quick, what else have you been watching?
I told Matt I've been watching a show called The Alienist. It streams on TNT, and it has some religious elements to it, but it's only 2 seasons. The first season was really dark and some difficult subject matter, and the other thing I've been watching is a show called Hannah on Amazon that similar to Nikita and all these shows where young women are made into assassins. How about you? What else are you watching?
Black Widow's coming out later. That's good.
Whittier's been telling me about that.
Let's see. So I've been watching the Eco Challenge. It's like a 600-kilometer race across the islands of Fiji. It's fantastically weird, but it's good. I really enjoyed that. And then I think we're almost done with that. And then next we're gonna be picking up Jim Gaffigan's Pale Tourist, where he does very specific comedy shows in different countries.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, man.
So,
well, join us again for What